Victoria Harrington's hand slammed the folder onto the table so hard the wine glasses trembled. "Sign it now or walk out of this family tonight." 11 pairs of eyes turned to Emily Carter, waiting for tears, for panic, for the girl from nowhere to finally show her place. Emily didn't blink. She picked up the pen before Victoria even finished speaking, and in that single silent motion, something in the room shifted that no one at that table would understand for another year. If you're watching this from your city tonight, tell me where you're tuning in from down in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't see coming. Now let's begin. The dining room at this Harrington estate smelled like beeswax candles and old money, the kind of scent that came from furniture polished for 100 years by people whose names nobody remembered. Emily sat at the long mahogany table with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the family around her perform a play they had rehearsed so many times they no longer noticed they were acting. Victoria Harrington sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a tribunal. She wore pearls that cost more than most people's cars, and her silver hair was swept back so tightly it looked like it hurt. She had not touched her food. She rarely did at these dinners. Eating in Victoria's world was something you did in private, away from witnesses who might see you as human. "I trust you understand why we're doing this," Victoria said, sliding the folder toward Emily with 2 fingers as though she didn't want to touch it any longer than necessary. "It's simply standard practice in families like ours. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." Emily almost laughed. Everything about that folder was personal. It was the exact width of a threat, wrapped in legal language, the same threat Victoria had been making with her eyes since the day Daniel brought Emily home for the first time. Daniel sat 2 seats down from his mother, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his plate. He had not said a single word since dinner began. Emily glanced at him, waiting, hoping some old and foolish part of her, still hoping that he would say something, anything, that he would look at his mother and say, "This isn't right," or that he would reach for Emily's hand under the table the way he used to when they were only dating, and the world hadn't yet taught him how to disappear. He didn't move. "Daniel," Victoria said without looking at her son, "would you like to explain the terms to your wife, or shall I?" "I think Emily can read," Daniel murmured. It was the closest thing to defiance he'd offered all evening, and even that came out sounding like an apology. Victoria's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course she can. Emily is very capable. That's precisely why I know she'll understand the wisdom of protecting the family's interests." The family's interests. Not the marriage, not Daniel's happiness, not even the appearance of love that the Harringtons were usually so careful to maintain in front of guests. Tonight there were no guests, only family, and Victoria had stopped pretending an hour ago. Emily opened the folder. The prenuptial agreement was thick, 40 pages of clauses designed by a law firm that billed by the quarter hour and existed almost exclusively to protect families like this one from families like Emily's. She read through it slowly, deliberately, while the room held its breath around her. She read about asset separation. She read about inheritance protections. She read a clause buried on page 31 that stated in the event of divorce, Emily Carter, Harrington would be entitled to nothing from the estate, the trusts, the businesses, or any property acquired during the marriage regardless of duration. Regardless of duration. They weren't just protecting their money. They were making sure that no matter how long she stayed, no matter what she gave up to be there, she would leave with nothing. It was designed to make her disposable. Emily felt something settle deep inside her chest, cold and clear, like water finding its level. She had expected this. She had known from the very first dinner 2 years ago, when Victoria looked her up and down and asked what her father did for a living, that this moment would eventually come. She had simply not known when. Now she did. She reached for the pen sitting beside the folder, the same pen Victoria had clearly placed there in advance, confident of the outcome. "Emily," Daniel said quietly, finally looking at her, "you don't have to—" "I want to," Emily said. Her voice was calm, steady. It didn't waver the way Victoria had expected it to. Around the table, several of the extended family members exchanged glances. Daniel's Uncle Richard, a man who had spent 30 years managing the family's investments and knew more about their finances than anyone in the room besides Victoria herself, leaned back in his chair with the faint expression of a man watching a hand of poker he didn't fully understand. Emily signed her name at the bottom of the page, clean, unhurried, the same signature she used on everything, the same signature her father had taught her to write when she was 11 years old, sitting beside him at his office desk while he explained the difference between a company that looked strong and a company that was strong. She closed the folder and slid it back toward Victoria. Silence. Victoria had expected tears. She had expected Emily to beg or to argue, or at the very least to look wounded, because that was what happened to women who married into families they didn't belong to. That was the script. Victoria had watched it play out with two of Daniel's cousins' wives, already women who had cried at this very table, women who had left the family within 3 years exactly as planned. Emily gave her none of that. The silence stretched, and it was Victoria, not Emily, who seemed unsettled by it. She reached for her wine glass and took a slow sip, buying herself a moment to recover her composure. "Well," Victoria said finally, "that was easier than I expected." "Was it what you wanted?" Emily asked. The question hung in the air, simple and direct, and somehow more unnerving than any protest could have been. "I want what's best for this family," Victoria said. "So do I," Emily said. And there was something in the way she said it, some quiet weight beneath the words that made Victoria's fingers tighten slightly around the stem of her glass. Daniel's father, Thomas Harrington, cleared his throat from the far end of the table. He was a quieter presence than his wife, a man who had built his career managing the appearance of wealth rather than the substance of it, and he rarely spoke at these gatherings unless forced to. "Shall we move on to dessert?" he offered in the tone of a man desperate to change the subject. The rest of the dinner passed the way most Harrington dinners did, with careful conversation about charity galas and golf memberships and which university the youngest cousin would be attending in the fall. Emily participated when spoken to and said little otherwise. She had learned over 2 years of marriage that the less she said at this table, the more she heard. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the dinner finally ended, and Emily and Daniel walked out to the car in silence. The estate stretched behind them 300 acres of manicured lawns and century-old oaks. The main house, lit up like something out of a magazine, spread warm gold light, spilling from every window, as though the family inside had nothing to hide. Daniel didn't speak until they were both in the car. The doors shut the estate's gates, closing slowly behind them in the rearview mirror. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" Emily asked. "For all of it. My mother, the prenup. I should have said something." "You could have," Emily said. She wasn't angry. That was the strange part even to herself. She had expected to feel angry, and instead she felt something quieter, something that had been building in her for months, and had finally tonight crossed some invisible threshold into certainty. "I didn't want to make things worse," Daniel said. "For who?" He didn't answer. Emily looked out the window at the dark trees rushing past, and she thought about her father who had died 3 years earlier after spending his entire career restructuring companies that looked healthy on paper and were rotting underneath. He used to tell her that the biggest lie in business wasn't a lie people told out loud, it was the lie of appearance. A company could look profitable for years while it was quietly bleeding out, propped up by debt nobody outside the boardroom ever saw. He had also told her something else, something she hadn't thought about in years until tonight. Every fortress has a door, Emily. People spend so much time admiring the walls they forget somebody built a door. Find the door. She thought about this prenup sitting in that folder, 40 pages designed to protect an empire that Victoria Harrington clearly believed was untouchable. She thought about the ease with which Victoria had slid it across the table, the confidence in her eyes, the certainty that Emily would simply comply and disappear when the time came, just like the others. "They think I'm the one with nothing to protect," Emily thought. "They have no idea what I've been building." "You're quiet," Daniel said, glancing at her. "I'm thinking," Emily said. "About the prenup. About a lot of things." He reached over and took her hand, and for a moment she let him, though something in her had already begun pulling away some part of her that had signed that document tonight, not as an act of surrender, but as the opening move of something Daniel Harrington did not yet know was being played. The Harrington estate had been in the family for 4 generations. It had survived 2 recessions, a divorce scandal in the 70s, and a fire in the East Wing that had made national news back when Thomas's father still ran the family's textile business. To the outside world, it looked eternal, the kind of property that would still be standing long after everyone currently living in it had died and been replaced by their children. Emily had grown up nothing like this. Her father, Robert Carter, had worked for a mid-sized firm in Ohio that specialized in corporate restructuring, the unglamorous work of walking into failing companies and telling their owners the truth nobody wanted to hear. He wasn't wealthy, not by the Harrington standards, but he was precise, methodical, and quietly brilliant in a way that never sought attention. He used to bring Emily to his office on weekends when she was a teenager, sitting her down with stacks of financial statements and teaching her patiently how to read the story hidden underneath the numbers. "Anyone can read a balance sheet," he told her once. "The real skill is reading what's missing from it." Emily had absorbed every lesson without fully understanding at the time that her father was preparing her for something. It wasn't until years later, after his death, after she had spent 2 years married into a family that looked at her like an intruder in her own home, that she understood exactly what he had given her. The Harringtons saw a woman who had married up. They saw a girl from Ohio who had gotten lucky, who didn't understand old money, who would eventually be grateful for whatever scraps of tolerance the family offered her. What they never saw was the woman who had spent every quiet evening for the past 8 months while Daniel worked late and Victoria hosted her endless charity dinners, sitting at her laptop, studying public records, corporate filings, and property liens connected to the Harrington name. It had started almost by accident. A conversation overheard at a family gathering, a passing comment from Thomas about a loan he was refinancing, a strange tension in the air whenever certain business matters came up at dinner. Emily's instincts, trained by years at her father's side, had picked up on details the rest of the family either didn't notice or chose not to see. The estate, it turned out, was not the untouchable fortress it appeared to be. Over the following months, Emily discovered a web of financial decisions that painted a very different picture from the one the Harringtons presented to the world. The 300 acres of pristine grounds were maintained on a shrinking operating budget. Several of the family's investment properties, once profitable, had been quietly sold off over the past decade to cover losses from a failed hospitality venture Thomas had championed in the early 2000s. There was debt, substantial debt restructured multiple times and buried under layers of holding companies designed to keep the family name separated from the numbers. Emily didn't tell Daniel any of this. She didn't tell anyone. She simply kept watching, kept learning, kept building a picture in her mind of exactly where the fortress's door might be. 2 weeks after the prenup dinner, Emily sat in her home office. The door closed, her laptop open in front of her. Daniel was traveling for work, something to do with a potential merger for the family's manufacturing division. And the house was quiet in the particular way that Emily had come to appreciate over the past 2 years. Quiet enough to think. Her phone buzzed, a text from Victoria. "Lunch on Thursday. The Harrington Foundation Gala Committee needs to finalize the guest list, and I'd like your input on the seating arrangements." Emily stared at the message for a long moment. Victoria rarely asked for her input on anything. This was new. She typed back a brief confirmation and set the phone down, returning her attention to the documents spread across her screen. She had spent the last several weeks tracing the ownership structure of a company called Meridian Holdings Group, a name that had appeared repeatedly in property records connected to a piece of land adjacent to the Harrington estate. It had taken careful digging to connect Meridian to the Harringtons, at all 3 layers of shell companies removed, but Emily's father had taught her exactly how to follow that kind of trail. What she found confirmed something she had suspected for weeks. The Harrington family didn't simply owe money to a bank. They owed money indirectly through a structure so convoluted it would take a forensic accountant months to untangle, to a private lending group that had quietly acquired distressed debt from the failed hospitality venture years earlier. That debt was secured in part against certain assets connected to the estate itself. Not the estate outright. The Harringtons were far too careful for that, but close enough that the right kind of pressure applied at the right point could create serious problems for a family that had spent generations building an image of untouchable stability. Emily leaned back in her chair, her heart beating a little faster than she wanted to admit. This was the door. She thought about closing the laptop right then, about telling herself this was a line she shouldn't cross, that whatever resentment she carried toward Victoria and the family's casual cruelty didn't justify what she was contemplating. But then she thought about the prenup, about the exact wording of that clause on page 31, regardless of duration, and about the look in Victoria's eyes when she slid that folder across the table like she was handing Emily a leash. They had made their intentions clear. Emily was disposable, a placeholder, a woman who would eventually be replaced quietly and efficiently the moment Daniel's family decided she no longer served a purpose. Fine, Emily thought. Let them believe that. She opened a new browser tab and began researching corporate law firms outside of Westchester County, firms with no connection to the Harrington name firms, discreet enough to help a private individual acquire distressed debt without drawing attention to who was actually behind the purchase. It would take money. Not an enormous amount, not yet, but enough that Emily would need to be careful about where it came from. She had her own savings, modest but not insignificant, built up over years of working as a financial analyst before she married Daniel, a career she had quietly continued in a reduced capacity, even after the wedding, much to Victoria's visible disapproval. Financial analyst was not, in Victoria's opinion, an appropriate occupation for a Harrington wife. Emily had kept working anyway. That decision, made 2 years earlier out of nothing more than stubborn pride, was about to become the foundation of everything that followed. Thursday's lunch with Victoria took place at a private club in Manhattan, the kind of place where the maitre d' knew Victoria's name and the wine list didn't include prices. Emily arrived on time. Victoria arrived 7 minutes late, a habit Emily had come to recognize as a small, deliberate assertion of dominance. "I'm so glad you could make it," Victoria said, settling into her chair with the practiced grace of a woman who had never once worried about how she looked doing anything. "I wanted to discuss the gala seating, but honestly, Emily, I also wanted to check in with you." "Check in?" "About the prenup. I know these things can feel cold clinical. I want you to understand it isn't personal." Victoria's tone carried the faint performative warmth of someone reciting a line she had used many times before. Daniel's grandmother insisted on the same arrangement with his grandfather's first wife. It's simply how families like ours protect what we've built. "I understand completely," Emily said. Victoria studied her for a moment, searching for some crack in the composure, some sign of the resentment she surely expected to find. She found none. "You're taking this remarkably well," Victoria said. "Would you prefer I didn't—" The question caught Victoria slightly off guard, a flicker of something crossing her face before she recovered. "I simply expected more emotion. Most young women in your position would." "I'm not most young women," Emily said, and smiled a small, unreadable smile that Victoria would think about more than once over the coming months without quite understanding why it unsettled her. They moved on to discussing the gala, an annual fundraiser hosted by the Harrington Foundation that drew nearly 200 guests from the upper echelons of Westchester and Manhattan society. Victoria spoke at length about the seating chart, about which donors needed to be placed, near which board members, about the delicate diplomacy required to keep certain rival families from sitting too close to one another. Emily listened, nodded, offered occasional suggestions, and all the while she catalogued names. Board members, major donors, family friends who sat on the boards of banks and investment firms. It was, she realized, an extraordinary amount of information being handed to her freely over salad and sparkling water by a woman who had no idea she was arming her enemy. "You seem distracted," Victoria said at one point. "Just thinking about the flowers," Emily said smoothly. "Peonies or hydrangeas for the centerpieces." Victoria brightened instantly, launching into a 10-minute discussion of floral arrangements, and Emily let her grateful for the redirection. By the time lunch ended, Emily had learned more about the Harrington Foundation's board structure, and by extension the family's broader financial network, than she had in the previous 6 months combined. She thanked Victoria for lunch, embraced her with the appropriate amount of warmth for the club's watching staff, and walked out onto the street feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Momentum. Over the following 2 months, Emily worked methodically, the same way her father had taught her to approach a failing company quietly without alerting the people whose failure you were documenting. She retained a small law firm in Chicago, chosen specifically because it had no ties to New York's old money circles, and began the slow, careful process of structuring an acquisition. She created a holding entity of her own registered under a name that carried no connection to Emily Carter or the Harrington family, layered behind enough legal separation that even a determined investigator would need weeks to trace it back to her. She had learned this technique, ironically, from watching how the Harringtons themselves structured their own affairs. If a family could hide their debt behind shell companies to protect their reputation, Emily could use the same architecture to hide her acquisition of that debt. The lending group holding the distressed debt from the failed hospitality venture was based in Chicago, a private equity firm called Ashford Capital Partners that specialized in acquiring troubled loans at a discount and either restructuring them for profit or, when the borrower proved uncooperative, using the leverage to force a favorable settlement. Emily's attorney, a sharp, discreet woman named Patricia Nguyen, made the initial contact. "They're motivated to sell," Patricia told Emily during one of their calls. "The loan has been underperforming for years. Interest payments have been sporadic. Ashford would rather offload it to a buyer willing to take on the collection risk than continue chasing a family with expensive lawyers." "What would it take to acquire the full position?" Emily asked. Patricia named a figure. It was significant, more than Emily had anticipated, more than her personal savings alone could cover. Emily sat with that number for 3 days. She thought about liquidating a portion of the investment portfolio she had built quietly over the years. Money her father had left her, money she had always intended to keep separate, untouched, a safety net for a future she hadn't yet defined. She thought about the risk, about what it would mean to commit nearly everything she had toward a plan built on nothing more than instinct and old resentment. Then she thought about page 31 of the prenup, regardless of duration. She called Patricia back. "I want to move forward," Emily said, "but I need it done in stages, quietly. I don't want anyone connecting the dots before it's finished." "Understood," Patricia said. "This kind of thing takes patience. Debt acquisitions like this rarely happen overnight." "I have patience," Emily said. It was perhaps the truest thing she had said in months. The negotiations with Ashford Capital took nearly 4 months, conducted entirely through Patricia's firm, with Emily's name appearing nowhere in the documentation. Ashford, eager to offload a stagnant asset, agreed to a structured sale with Emily's holding company, acquiring the debt in 3 separate tranches to avoid drawing attention through a single large transaction. During those 4 months, life at the Harrington estate continued exactly as it always had. Victoria hosted her dinners. Daniel worked long hours, increasingly absent, increasingly distracted by whatever pressures were building within the family's business dealings that he refused to discuss with Emily in any detail. Thomas grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study with the door closed, a habit that Victoria dismissed at dinner as simply Thomas being Thomas. Emily watched it all with the patient, careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening beneath the surface, even as the family around her remained oblivious. At one particular dinner, 6 weeks into the acquisition process, Thomas arrived late, his tie slightly loosened, an unusual sign of disarray for a man who prided himself on composure. "Everything all right, dear?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Fine," Thomas said, sitting down heavily. "Just some irregularities with one of the accounts. Nothing to worry about." "What kind of irregularities?" Daniel asked, looking up from his plate for the first time all evening. "Payment discrepancies. Our finance team is looking into it." Thomas waved a hand dismissively, but Emily noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his wineglass. "Probably an administrative error on the lender's side." Emily kept her eyes on her plate, her expression carefully neutral, while inside her chest, something quiet and satisfied unfurled like a slow exhale. It was working. Ashford Capital, per the terms of the sale, had begun transferring servicing rights to Emily's holding company in stages, and the family's finance team, accustomed to dealing with a stable, predictable lender, had started noticing changes. Payment instructions had shifted. Points of contact had changed. The kind of small, technical irregularities that meant nothing to anyone unfamiliar with debt servicing, but meant everything to a family whose entire financial structure depended on those relationships remaining stable and invisible. "I'm sure it's nothing," Victoria said, though her voice carried the faintest edge of unease. Thomas, perhaps it's time to have Richard look into it more closely. I already asked him to, Thomas said. He says the paper trail is unusually complicated, more complicated than it should be for a straightforward refinancing situation. Complicated how? Daniel asked. I don't know yet, Thomas admitted, but I don't like not knowing. The conversation moved on, redirected by Victoria toward safer topics, but Emily noticed the tension that lingered at the table for the rest of the evening, a tension that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. The Harringtons, for the first time in a very long time, had encountered something they couldn't immediately explain, and the not knowing unsettled them far more than any direct confrontation could have. Later that night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders tense. Something's not right with the business, he said. I don't know what, but my father's worried. Really worried, not just his usual anxiety. What do you think it is? Emily asked, sitting beside him, her voice soft, careful. I don't know. Some issue with one of our lenders. Richard says the account structure looks strange, like someone's been quietly buying pieces of our debt. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. It doesn't make sense. Why would anyone do that? Maybe it's nothing, Emily said. Maybe it really is an administrative error. Maybe, Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced. He looked at Emily, something almost pleading in his expression. You always know how to make sense of things like this, financial things. Could you take a look at some of the documents if I bring them home, just to see if anything jumps out? For a moment, something in Emily nearly cracked. The old part of her, the part that had married Daniel because she loved him, because she believed once foolishly that love could be enough to bridge the distance between her world and his, wanted to reach for him to tell him everything, to warn him before it was too late. But she thought of the prenup. She thought of Victoria's cold, satisfied expression as she slid that folder across the table. She thought of 2 years spent being tolerated rather than embraced, being useful rather than valued, being seen as a placeholder that could be discarded the moment convenience demanded it. Of course, Emily said, instead her voice warm, steady, betraying nothing. Bring me whatever you have. I'll take a look. Daniel exhaled some of the tension, leaving his shoulders grateful, unaware that he had just handed his wife a direct line into exactly how much the family already suspected and exactly how much time she had left before the truth surfaced on its own. Emily lay awake long after Daniel fell asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that had never fully felt like hers. She thought about her father, about the office in Ohio, about the stacks of financial statements he used to spread across his desk. Anyone can read a balance sheet. The real skill is reading what's missing from it. She thought about Victoria's voice at that first dinner, cold and precise, nothing personal. She thought about the clause on page 31 about the word disposable that no one had spoken aloud, but that had been written into every line of that document regardless. Somewhere beneath her 300 acres of manicured lawns and century-old oaks sat silent under the night sky, a fortress the Harringtons believed had stood for generations and would stand for generations more. They had no idea the door was already open. And Emily, staring into the darkness above her, felt something settle inside her that was neither anger nor triumph, but something quieter, something that had been building since the moment she picked up that pen and signed her name without a single tear. Clarity. The acquisition would be complete within weeks, and when it was, the Harringtons would finally understand exactly what they had handed her the night they thought they were protecting themselves. They had built their empire on the assumption that no one outside the family would ever look closely enough to find the door. They had never imagined the door had already been opened quietly, patiently, by the woman sitting silently at the end of their table, the one they had mistaken for 2 long years for someone who had nothing to offer but her silence. Daniel came home the following night with a leather briefcase Emily had never seen him carry, before the kind of case that belonged to lawyers and accountants, not to a man who spent his days negotiating shipping contracts for the family's manufacturing division. He set it on the kitchen counter like it might bite him. "These are copies," he said. "Richard doesn't know I took them. If my father finds out—" "He won't find out from me," Emily said. She meant it in a way Daniel couldn't possibly understand, and she hated just slightly how easily the words came out of her mouth. She had spent 2 years learning to speak in half-truths at that dinner table, and now the skill had followed her home into the one place she had always tried to keep honest. Daniel opened the briefcase and spread the papers across the counter. Loan statements, servicing notices, a tangle of correspondence between the family's finance office and a lender identified only by an account number, no name attached to any of it. Emily recognized the formatting immediately. She had built it herself through Patricia's firm specifically so that anyone looking at it would find nothing but dead ends. Richard says the servicing rights transferred 3 times in the last 2 months, Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. 3 times. Do you know how unusual that is? Debt doesn't just move around like that unless somebody's buying it up on purpose. Buying it up for what reason? Emily asked, keeping her voice light, curious, the voice of a wife trying to help her husband make sense of something frightening. That's what nobody can figure out. Daniel sat down heavily at the counter, staring at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into an answer if he looked hard enough. Richard thinks it might be a competitor, someone trying to get leverage over my father before a merger. He thinks it could be corporate sabotage. Emily picked up one of the servicing notices, scanning it slowly, buying herself a moment to steady her breathing. Corporate sabotage. If that was the story taking shape in Richard's mind, it was a story that led nowhere near her, and that was for now exactly what she needed. "Has your father called the bank directly?" she asked. "Sometimes these transfers are just portfolio management. Lenders sell off pieces of debt to rebalance their books all the time. It doesn't have to mean anything sinister." "He's tried," Daniel said. "Every call goes to a different department. Every department says someone else handles that account. It's like chasing smoke." It was, Emily thought, exactly like chasing smoke, because she had built it that way, layer by layer, month by month, with Patricia's careful guidance. She felt a small, uncomfortable twist of guilt, watching Daniel's frustration, watching him, genuinely afraid for the family he came from, and she reminded herself quickly, forcefully, that the family sitting on the other end of that fear was the same family that had slid a prenup across the table and called it nothing personal. "I'm sure your father's team will figure it out," Emily said. "These things usually resolve themselves." Daniel looked at her, and for a moment, something in his expression made Emily's heart stumble. Not suspicion, not yet, but something closer to desperation, a man looking for solid ground and finding none. "I just have this feeling," he said quietly, "like something's coming, like we're standing on ice and nobody can tell how thick it is." Emily reached over and covered his hand with hers, and the gesture was not entirely a lie because some part of her did still care what happened to him, even now, even after everything. "Whatever happens," she said, "you'll get through it. Your family always does." She wasn't sure as she said it whether she believed her own words, and she wasn't sure either which outcome she actually wanted. 3 weeks passed, and the tension inside the Harrington estate thickened with each passing dinner. Thomas grew visibly older during that stretch, the lines around his eyes deepening, his once immaculate posture beginning to stoop under a weight none of them could name out loud. Victoria compensated the way she always did, by hosting more entertaining, more filling the house with noise and laughter, designed to paper over the cracks nobody wanted to acknowledge. At one Sunday brunch with the extended family gathered on the estate's east terrace, Victoria raised her champagne glass and announced with forced brightness that the Harrington Foundation Gala would proceed as planned in 6 weeks' time. "Bigger than ever this year," she said. 300 guests. The governor's office has confirmed attendance." Emily watched the family's practice smiles the way everyone raised their glasses in unison, performing unity for an audience of no one but themselves. Daniel's cousin Whitney, seated beside Emily, leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you heard what's going on with the accounts?" Whitney asked. "My father says it's serious. Like lawyer serious. I try not to get involved in business matters," Emily said carefully. "Smart," Whitney said, sipping her champagne. "Victoria would eat you alive if she thought you were poking around in family finances. She barely tolerates you knowing which fork to use." The comment was meant as a joke tossed off lightly between cousins, but it landed in Emily's chest like a struck match. She smiled anyway, the way she had trained herself to smile at that family for 2 years, and said nothing, because saying nothing had become the sharpest weapon she owned. Later that afternoon, while the family lingered over dessert, Emily excused herself and walked the length of the estate's rear gardens past the rose beds Victoria had imported from a nursery in the Hudson Valley, past the old stone fountain that had stopped working sometime around Daniel's 12th birthday, and never been repaired because repairing it would have required admitting there wasn't budget for it. She had walked these gardens 100 times before, always as a guest, always as someone tolerated rather than welcomed. Her phone buzzed. Patricia. "We have a problem," Patricia said, her voice clipped professional, carrying just enough urgency to make Emily's stomach tighten. "What kind of problem?" "Richard Harrington hired an outside forensic accounting firm. They've traced 2 of the 3 transfers back to a holding entity in Delaware. It's not connected to you directly, not yet, but it's closer than we planned for at this stage." Emily stopped walking, standing very still beside the broken fountain, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the lawn. "How close?" "Close enough that if they keep pulling the thread, they could eventually connect the Delaware entity to the firm that manages it, and from there potentially to me. It won't happen this week, maybe not this month, but it's not the kind of margin I'd like to be working with." "What do you recommend?" "We accelerate," Patricia said. "Complete the 3rd tranche now instead of waiting the additional 6 weeks we discussed. Once you hold the full position, it won't matter what they trace because the leverage will already belong to you. Right now, you're vulnerable because you're still in the acquisition phase. Once it's finished, you're not vulnerable at all. You're simply the owner." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the late sun warm against her face, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a held breath. "Do it," she said. "Accelerate the 3rd tranche. It'll require the remainder of the funds we discussed. All of it transferred within the week." "Do it," Emily said again, firmer this time. She hung up the phone and stood alone in the garden for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of laughter drifting from the terrace, the Harrington family celebrating an event 6 weeks away, unaware that the ground beneath their celebration had just shifted in ways none of them could yet perceive. That night, Emily transferred the remainder of her father's inheritance, every dollar of the safety net she had promised herself she would never touch, into the holding company Patricia's firm managed on her behalf. She did it alone in her home office, the door locked, the only light in the room coming from the glow of her laptop screen. Her hands did not shake. She had expected them to. When it was done, she sat back in her chair and allowed herself for the first time in months to feel the full size of what she had just done. She owned the door now, all of it. The following week, Richard Harrington arrived at a family dinner with a leather folder of his own, thicker than the one Victoria had used to present the prenup, and the moment he set it on the table, the entire mood of the room shifted. Thomas looked pale. Victoria's carefully composed expression flickered just briefly into something raw. "I have an update," Richard said, "and I want everyone to stay calm." "Just say it," Thomas said. The forensic team traced the debt transfers to a holding company registered in Delaware. The company has no public officers listed, no discoverable ownership records, and appears to have been structured specifically to prevent exactly this kind of tracing. Richard paused, glancing around the table. "Whoever is behind this knows exactly what they're doing. This isn't an accident, and it isn't a competitor making a clumsy move. This is deliberate, patient, and extremely well executed." "Who would do this to us?" Victoria asked, her voice sharper than Emily had ever heard it. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But whoever it is, they now control a significant portion of the debt secured against portions of this estate. If they wanted to, they could call in payments, force renegotiation, or in a worst-case scenario initiate collection proceedings that could put pieces of this property at risk." The table went silent. Emily kept her eyes lowered, her expression arranged into the appropriate mixture of concern and confusion that a loyal daughter-in-law should display upon hearing such news. "How much of the debt do they control?" Daniel asked. Richard hesitated. "As of the most recent servicing transfer, all of it." The word landed like a dropped glass, shattering the last of the room's composure. Victoria's hand rose to her chest. Thomas closed his eyes. Daniel looked around the table, searching for some explanation, some anchor, and found none. "All of it," Thomas repeated hollowly. "All of it," Richard confirmed. "That's not possible," Victoria said. "We would have known. Someone would have told us." "Someone did," Richard said. "Me, right now." Emily felt the weight of the entire table's fear pressing into the room thick and suffocating, and beneath that fear quiet and unnoticed, she felt something that she immediately tried to suppress: satisfaction. She had built this, every piece of it methodically, patiently, exactly the way her father taught her, and now she was watching it detonate at the center of the family that had once slid a prenup across this very table and told her it wasn't personal. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. "Now we find out who's behind this," Richard said, "and we find out what they want." Victoria's eyes swept the table, sharp and calculating, as though she might find the answer written on one of their faces. Her gaze lingered on Emily for a fraction of a second longer than it lingered on anyone else, and Emily's pulse spiked. But Victoria's expression revealed nothing beyond generalized suspicion, the reflexive distrust of a woman who had never fully accepted an outsider into her family and was now searching for anyone to blame. "Emily," Victoria said slowly, "you worked in finance before you married Daniel, didn't you?" The question landed like a blade balanced on its point, and Emily felt every eye at the table shift toward her. "I was a financial analyst," Emily said, keeping her voice even, unbothered. "Nothing close to the scale of what Richard is describing." "Of course not," Victoria said, though something in her tone suggested the thought had lodged itself and would not easily be dislodged. "I only meant perhaps you might have some insight, some perspective on how these kinds of holding structures typically work." "I'm afraid I don't have the expertise for something this sophisticated," Emily said. "This sounds like it required real institutional resources, investment banking, private equity, that sort of thing." It was, Emily thought, a masterful piece of misdirection, offered with just enough humility to sound sincere, and she watched Victoria's suspicion visibly deflate, replaced by frustration directed elsewhere. "Then who," Victoria said, turning back to Richard, "has that kind of institutional backing and a reason to target this family?" "That's what the forensic team is working to determine," Richard said. "It could take weeks. This kind of structure is designed to resist exactly this kind of investigation." "Weeks," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have weeks. If this holding company decides to call in the debt or force a renegotiation at unfavorable terms, we could be looking at a liquidity crisis within days." "I understand the urgency," Richard said. "I'm doing everything I can." Victoria set down her wine glass with a controlled precision that somehow conveyed more fury than if she had slammed it. "Everything you can clearly hasn't been enough, Richard. This family has trusted you with our finances for 30 years. And in 30 years, Richard said, a rare flash of defensiveness crossing his face, "I've never seen an acquisition this carefully constructed. Whoever did this isn't some amateur trying to make a quick profit. They planned this for months, possibly longer. They understood our financial structure well enough to find the exact pressure point that would matter most." Emily kept her eyes on her plate, her heart hammering beneath a stillness she had spent 2 years perfecting. They had no idea how right Richard was. Dinner ended early that night, the family too shaken to maintain even the pretense of normal conversation. As guests departed, Daniel lingered near the front hall with Emily, his face drawn exhausted in a way she had never seen before. "I keep thinking about what Richard said," Daniel murmured as they walked to the car. "Someone who understood our financial structure well enough to find the pressure point. That's not random. That's someone who knows us, knows this family personally." Emily's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I don't know what I'm saying," Daniel admitted, running both hands through his hair. "I just keep going through everyone we know. Business partners, old rivals. My mother's had disputes with half the families in this county over the years. Any one of them could have a motive." "You think it's someone you know socially?" "I think it has to be," Daniel said. "A stranger wouldn't know enough to target us this precisely. It has to be someone close, someone who's been paying attention." They reached the car, and Daniel paused before opening the door, looking at Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read, something caught between exhaustion and a question he wasn't yet ready to ask out loud. "You've been paying attention too," he said quietly. "More than I ever have, honestly. You always notice things I miss." Emily's breath caught just slightly, and she forced her expression to remain open, unguarded. "I notice things because I care about you," she said. "That's all." Daniel studied her for a long moment, and then, as though embarrassed by his own suspicion, he shook his head and opened the car door. I'm sorry. I'm not thinking straight. This whole thing has me seeing shadows everywhere. It's understandable, Emily said, sliding into the passenger seat, her pulse still racing beneath her calm exterior. Your family's under a lot of pressure. They drove home in silence, the estate's gates closing behind them in the mirror, and Emily stared out at the passing trees, replaying the conversation, recognizing how close Daniel had come, without even realizing it, to naming the truth sitting directly beside him. She would need to be more careful. The family was frightened, now frightened enough to start looking harder, and frightened people Emily knew from her father's lessons often stumbled onto truths they weren't consciously searching for. 2 days later, Victoria called an emergency meeting of what she referred to as the inner family, which excluded cousins and extended relations and included only Thomas Daniel Richard and, for the first time in Emily's memory, Emily herself. They gathered in Thomas's study, a room Emily had entered perhaps twice in 2 years of marriage, always briefly, always by accident. Dark wood paneling, shelves of leather-bound books that Emily suspected had never been read. A large mahogany desk behind which Thomas now sat, looking smaller than Emily had ever seen him. I've asked Emily to join us, Victoria said, because I think given her background she might offer a useful perspective, even if only as a sounding board. Emily recognized immediately what this was, not an invitation born of trust, but a test, an attempt to keep Emily close enough to observe her reactions, to see whether the family's newest and most carefully watched member might reveal something under pressure. She accepted the seat offered to her with a calm, gracious nod, betraying nothing. "Richard, give us the latest," Thomas said. "The forensic team has hit a wall," Richard said grimly. The Delaware entity is managed by a law firm in Chicago, one with an ironclad reputation for client confidentiality. They won't disclose beneficial ownership without a court order, and obtaining that order would require us to file suit, which would make this entire situation public. Once it's public, the family's credit relationships, our reputation with other lenders, potentially even the foundation's donor base, could all be affected. "So we're trapped," Thomas said. "We can't find out who's doing this without exposing ourselves to the exact kind of scrutiny that could make things worse." "Essentially, yes," Richard said. Victoria's fingers drummed once against the desk, sharp and controlled. "Has anyone attempted direct contact, simply reaching out to the holding company and asking what they want?" "I sent an inquiry through the law firm 2 days ago," Richard said. No response yet. Emily, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, felt her pulse quicken. She knew about that inquiry. Patricia had forwarded it to her the previous morning, a carefully worded letter requesting a conversation regarding the debt position and the Harrington family's intentions to remain current on payments. Emily had told Patricia to hold off on responding, uncertain in that moment of exactly how she wanted this to unfold. "What if they never respond?" Daniel asked. "What if this is just meant to sit there, this threat hanging over us indefinitely with no resolution?" "Then we live with uncertainty," Thomas said heavily, "which frankly might be the entire point. Whoever did this may simply want us to feel exactly what we're feeling right now, powerless." The word hung in the room, and Emily felt its weight settle over her chest, heavier than she expected. Powerless. It was exactly the word she might have used to describe how she felt at that dinner table months earlier, signing her name to a document that told her in 40 pages of legal language that she meant nothing to this family beyond what convenience allowed. Now the Harringtons understood the feeling. And Emily discovered sitting quietly among them that watching them understand it did not feel as satisfying as she had once imagined it would. It felt instead complicated, heavy in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Emily," Victoria said suddenly, "you've been very quiet. Surely a financial analyst has some thoughts on all this." Every eye in the room turned toward her, and Emily felt the full weight of the moment pressing down a test she could not afford to fail. "I think," Emily said slowly, choosing each word with the precision her father had taught her, "that whoever is behind this clearly has significant resources and significant patience. People don't structure acquisitions this carefully unless they're planning for the long term. I'd guess they're not looking for a quick payout. I'd guess they're looking for control." The room absorbed this in silence. "Control of what?" Thomas asked. "I don't know." Emily said, which was in its own strange way almost true, because even she hadn't fully decided yet what the endgame would look like. But I'd be cautious about assuming this is only about money. If it were only about money, they'd have already made contact demanding a settlement. The silence itself might be telling you something. Richard leaned forward, studying Emily with new interest. That's actually a sharp observation. If they wanted a quick financial win, we'd have heard from them by now. The silence suggests something more deliberate. Deliberate how? Victoria asked, a threat of alarm entering her voice. I don't know, Emily repeated. And this time it was entirely true, because the truth was that Emily herself did not yet know what she wanted the ending to look like. She knew only that she held the leverage now complete and total, and that somewhere beneath the fear currently gripping this family, there existed a decision she alone would eventually have to make. The meeting ended without resolution, the family no closer to identifying their adversary than they had been an hour earlier, and as they filed out of the study, Victoria caught Emily's arm gently, an unusual gesture of familiarity that Emily had never once experienced from her mother-in-law. Thank you for your input tonight, Victoria said, and there was something almost vulnerable in her voice, a crack in the armor Emily had never seen before. I know I haven't always made you feel welcome in this family. Emily felt something twist painfully in her chest, an unwanted flicker of guilt threatening to surface. Victoria, I mean it, Victoria said, and for the first time in 2 years she looked directly at Emily, not with suspicion or condescension, but with something closer to genuine fear. I've built my entire life around protecting this family, this name, this legacy, and right now, for the first time, I don't know how to protect it. I don't know who's coming for us or why or what they want, and that terrifies me more than anything ever has. Emily stood very still, watching the woman who had slid a prenup across the dinner table with cold, deliberate cruelty, now standing before her small and frightened, asking in her own indirect way for reassurance. We'll figure it out, Emily said quietly. It was, she would later realize, the closest she ever came to telling Victoria the truth in that moment, and she would spend weeks afterward wondering whether some deeper part of her had wanted Victoria to hear it, to understand, before the final reckoning arrived, exactly who had been sitting at her table all along. But that night, Emily said nothing more. She walked out of the study down the long hallway, lined with portraits of Harringtons who had never once had to fight for anything, and out into the cool evening air, carrying inside her the full weight of the empire she now quietly controlled. Somewhere behind her, in that same estate, Thomas sat alone at his desk long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at numbers that no longer made sense to him, searching for a name he would not find, while 300 acres of land his family had protected for 4 generations sat exposed for the first time in its history to a threat it could neither see nor understand. And somewhere in that darkness, Emily Carter, the woman they had once dismissed as lucky to have married, inhaled the only key that mattered, waiting with the same patient stillness her father had taught her years ago in a modest office in Ohio, for the exact moment when showing her hand would finally mean something. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning, and the moment Emily heard the tone in her voice, she knew something had shifted. They responded, Patricia said. The inquiry Richard Harrington's firm sent 2 weeks ago. Ashford's old contact forwarded it to us since we now hold the position, and I think you need to see it before we decide how to answer. Read it to me, Emily said, gripping her phone tighter than she meant to. It's from Richard directly, not just the law firm. He's requesting a meeting with, quote, whoever controls the current debt position to discuss what he calls a mutually beneficial resolution. He's offering to negotiate directly, no lawyers, no intermediaries. He wants to fly to Chicago personally if that's where the entity is based. Emily sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the phone pressed to her ear, her mind racing through implications. Richard was smart. Richard had spent 30 years managing money for a family that had never once needed to explain itself to anyone, and now he was offering to get on a plane and beg a stranger for mercy. What do you want me to tell him? Patricia asked. Nothing yet, Emily said. Stall. Tell him the entity is reviewing the request and will respond within 30 days. 30 days is a long time to leave a family twisting, Emily. I know exactly how long 30 days is, Emily said, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than she intended, because Patricia went quiet on the other end of the line. Can I ask you something? Patricia said finally. Not as your attorney, just as someone who's watched you build this for the better part of a year. Go ahead. What's the actual goal here? Because I've handled acquisitions like this before. Distressed debt leverage plays all of it. Usually there's a clear endpoint, a settlement, a forced sale, something concrete. But you've never told me what you actually want out of this, and I'm starting to wonder if you know. Emily stared out the kitchen window at the small backyard she and Daniel shared, so much smaller than the Harrington estate, so much more honest in its modesty. She thought about that question for a long moment before answering. I want them to understand what it feels like, Emily said quietly. To sit at a table and realize the ground beneath them was never as solid as they believed. That's not a business goal, Patricia said. That's personal. Maybe it's both, Emily said. Patricia sighed, the sound of a lawyer who had seen enough cases built on emotion rather than strategy to know how dangerous that combination could become. Just be careful. The more personal this gets, the more mistakes people make. And you've been flawless so far. Don't let feelings be the thing that finally trips you up. Emily promised she would be careful, and she meant it when she said it, though she would come to realize in the weeks that followed exactly how difficult that promise would be to keep. 3 days later, Daniel came home from work early, something he almost never did, and Emily knew immediately from the set of his shoulders that something had changed. My father wants to sell the East Wing, Daniel said, dropping his keys onto the counter with more force than necessary. The historic section of the estate, the part that's been in the family since before the Civil War. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sell it to who? A preservation group. They've apparently been trying to buy it for 20 years, and my father always refused. Now he's meeting with them next week. Daniel sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. He says it's the only way to raise enough liquidity to satisfy the debt if this mystery lender decides to call in the full balance. He's talking about selling pieces of the estate, Emily. My grandmother's estate. That sounds extreme, Emily said carefully, though inside her mind was already calculating the implications. She hadn't called in the balance. She hadn't made a single demand. Thomas was preparing to dismantle his own family's legacy based on fear alone, based on the sheer terror of not knowing what was coming. It is extreme, Daniel said. It's also apparently necessary. Richard ran the numbers. If the lender decides to be aggressive, calls the loan force's immediate repayment, we don't have the liquid assets to cover it without selling something. And selling the manufacturing division would take months, maybe longer, given market conditions. The estate is the only asset that could move fast enough. Emily reached over and took Daniel's hand, and this time, the gesture felt heavier than it had before, weighted with something she couldn't quite name. Guilt, certainly. But also something that surprised her more, a flicker of doubt about whether this was truly the reckoning she had wanted, or whether it had already grown into something larger and more destructive than she intended. Has your father tried reaching the lender again? She asked. Richard's been trying for weeks, still nothing. It's like shouting into a void. Daniel looked at her, his eyes tired in a way that made him look older than his 34 years. I keep thinking whoever's doing this, they must hate us. Really hate us to sit there in silence and watch a family tear itself apart, trying to guess their next move. Emily's throat tightened. Maybe they don't hate the whole family, she said quietly. Maybe there's just one thing they can't forgive. Daniel looked up at her, something shifting in his expression, a question forming behind his eyes that he didn't quite have the words to ask yet. What do you mean, nothing? Emily said quickly. I just mean people don't usually go to this much trouble over abstract hatred. Usually there's something specific, something personal. Like what? I don't know, Emily said, and this time the lie felt heavier in her mouth than any she had told before. I'm just thinking out loud. Daniel studied her for a long moment, and Emily held his gaze, forcing herself not to look away, not to give him any reason to keep pulling on that thread. Finally, he exhaled and looked back down at his hands. I keep wondering if it's someone we know, he said. Someone who's been close enough to see how this family really operates. Because you're right. This isn't random hatred. This feels targeted, personal. It might just be business, Emily offered. People do brutal things for money without any personal grudge at all. Maybe, Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced, and Emily felt the walls of her carefully constructed secret pressing tighter with every conversation like this one. That weekend, Victoria called another family gathering, though this time the tone had shifted entirely from the earlier dinners. Gone was the practiced elegance, the effortless hosting Victoria had spent decades perfecting. In its place was something rawer, more desperate, a woman fighting to hold together a world that was quietly dissolving beneath her feet. "I've asked the foundation board to postpone the gala," Victoria announced at the start of dinner, and the words landed with the weight of a confession. "Given the circumstances, I don't think it's appropriate to host 300 guests while we're dealing with this uncertainty." The table absorbed this in stunned silence. The Harrington Foundation Gala had run uninterrupted for 22 years. Victoria had once told Emily with unmistakable pride that the gala had continued even the year Thomas's mother died, because legacy in Victoria's world did not pause for grief. "Mother," Daniel said carefully, "are you sure that's necessary? Canceling the gala will draw attention. People will ask questions." "People are already asking questions," Victoria snapped, and then catching herself softened, though the effort visibly cost her something. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to raise my voice. I simply think, given the sensitivity of the situation, that a gala celebrating this family's prosperity would be poorly timed." Thomas said nothing, staring at his plate, and Emily noticed for the first time how much weight he had lost in the past month. His suit hung looser on his frame. His hands, when he reached for his water glass, moved with a slight, unfamiliar tremor. "Has there been any progress at all?" Whitney asked from further down the table, her earlier lightness entirely gone. "None," Richard said grimly. "We've retained additional counsel to explore legal options, but without knowing who we're dealing with, our options are limited. We could file suit against the holding entity, directly force disclosure through the courts, but that process could take a year or more, and the moment we file, this entire situation becomes public record. Every bank we do business with, every partner, every donor to the foundation would see it." "And if we don't file suit?" Daniel asked. "Then we wait," Richard said, "and hope whoever's holding this leverage decides to use it in a way we can negotiate, rather than a way that destroys us outright." Emily sat very still through this exchange, watching the family she had spent 2 years being tolerated by now unravel in real time, and she felt the full complexity of what she had built, pressing down on her chest. She had wanted them to feel powerless. She had wanted Victoria to understand viscerally what it felt like to sit at a table and realize the ground was never as solid as it appeared. She had not fully anticipated what it would feel like to watch Thomas's hands shake, or to hear Victoria's voice crack, or to see Daniel age years in the span of a few weeks, carrying a fear he didn't even fully understand. "I need some air," Emily said, suddenly standing from the table. "Emily." Daniel started to rise. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need a minute." She walked quickly through the house, out through the side door that led to the rear gardens, and stood alone beneath the darkening sky, breathing hard, her hands pressed against her stomach, as though she could physically hold herself together. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned, expecting Daniel, and found Victoria instead standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "Are you all right?" Victoria asked, and the question carried none of its usual formality. It sounded for the first time Emily could remember entirely genuine. "I'm just worried," Emily said, "for all of you." Victoria studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened further, cracking open in a way Emily had never witnessed in 2 years of marriage. "You know," Victoria said quietly, "when Daniel first brought you home, I'll admit I didn't think you'd last. I thought you'd realize how difficult this family could be, how much this world expects of the people who marry into it, and you'd leave within a year." "I know," Emily said. "But you stayed," Victoria continued, "through every dinner where I made you feel small, through the prenup, through all of it. And now watching you tonight, genuinely upset on our behalf, I find myself wondering if I misjudged you entirely." Emily felt something crack inside her chest, sharp and sudden, a pain she hadn't prepared herself for. Victoria, I mean it, Victoria said, reaching out and in a gesture so unexpected that Emily nearly flinched, taking her hand. Whatever happens with this financial mess, I want you to know, I see now that you've been a better addition to this family than I ever gave you credit for. The words should have felt like victory. They should have tasted like everything Emily had wanted to hear since that first cold dinner 2 years ago, when Victoria asked what her father did for a living with barely concealed condescension. Instead, they felt like a knife turning slowly in her chest, because Emily knew, standing there in the dark garden holding her mother-in-law's hand, that everything Victoria was praising her for, her calm strength, her steady support, was built directly on top of the very destruction Victoria was currently mourning. "Thank you." Emily managed her voice barely steady. Victoria squeezed her hand once and released it, wiping quickly at her eyes before any tears could fully form, composing herself with the practiced discipline of a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to be seen falling apart. "We should go back inside. Thomas will worry." They walked back toward the house together, and Emily felt the full crushing weight of what she had built settling over her with every step heavier now than it had ever been before. That night, lying awake beside Daniel, Emily found herself replaying Victoria's words over and over. "A better addition to this family than I ever gave you credit for." She thought about the prenup, about page 31, about 2 years of small cruelties delivered with a smile dismissive, comments about her background, pointed questions about her father's modest career, the countless small ways Victoria had made clear that Emily would always be an outsider in this world. And yet Thomas's shaking hands, and yet Daniel's exhausted eyes, and yet Victoria standing in the garden genuinely frightened, genuinely vulnerable for what might have been the first time in her adult life. Emily had wanted this. She had built this piece by piece with the same patience and precision her father had taught her. She had told herself throughout the entire process that the Harringtons deserved to understand exactly what it felt like to have the ground disappear beneath them. But watching it happen in real time to real people who bled and feared and loved each other in their own flawed way felt entirely different from planning it in the abstract. She thought about calling Patricia in the morning and telling her to stop everything, to quietly sell the debt back, to disappear before anyone traced it further, to let the Harringtons rebuild their sense of security and never know how close they had come to losing everything. She thought about it seriously, turning the idea over in her mind through the long hours of the night, and by morning she still hadn't decided. The decision was made for her 3 days later in a way she never anticipated. Daniel came home from the office, pale and shaking, closing the front door behind him with unusual care, as though the house itself might shatter if he moved too quickly. "Emily," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Her heart stopped. "What is it?" "Richard's forensic team finally cracked part of the ownership structure," Daniel said, his voice tight with something between fear and disbelief. "Not all of it, but enough. The Delaware entity connects to a law firm in Chicago, and the law firm's billing records, which Richard's people obtained through a source I don't fully understand, show a pattern of communication with an individual client based in Westchester County." Emily's blood went cold. "They don't have a name yet," Daniel continued, watching her face with an intensity that made it impossible to hide anything. "But they're close, Emily. Days away, maybe less. And I need to ask you because I can't stop thinking about it, because it's been eating at me for weeks now, and I need you to look me in the eye and tell me the truth." He paused, and the silence between them stretched taut, unbearable, the entire foundation of their marriage balanced on the edge of whatever question he was about to ask. "Is it you?" Daniel said quietly. "Emily, is it you?" Emily stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, the question hanging in the air between them like something alive. "Is it you, Emily? Is it you?" She could feel her own pulse in her throat thicken fast, and for one terrible second, every carefully constructed sentence she had prepared for exactly this moment, months ago in the quiet of her home office, evaporated completely. She had rehearsed this. She had told herself over and over that if this moment ever came, she would be ready. She was not ready. "Daniel," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands hidden at her sides were trembling. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because I need to know," he said. Because I've spent weeks watching you stay calm through all of this while everyone else falls apart, and I told myself that was just who you are, that you're steady, that you don't panic. But then tonight, Richard says Westchester County, and all I could think about was you, sitting at that table, signing that prenup without a single tear. And I thought, what if that wasn't strength? What if that was patience? Emily felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she didn't move. You think I would do this to your family? I don't know what to think anymore, Daniel said, and his voice cracked on the last word. The sound of a man who had been holding himself together by sheer will for weeks and had finally run out of rope. I think about the prenup, and I think about how humiliating that must have been for you. And I think if it were me, if someone did that to me, I might want them to feel exactly what they made me feel. So this is about revenge in your mind, Emily said. You think I'm capable of destroying your entire family because your mother made me sign a piece of paper. I don't know what you're capable of, Daniel said. That's the problem. I've been married to you for 2 years, and I realize right now, standing in this kitchen, that I don't actually know. The words landed harder than anything Victoria had ever said to her, harder than the prenup, harder than 2 years of small dismissals delivered with a smile. Because this wasn't Victoria. This was Daniel. The man she had once believed would stand between her and his family's cruelty, the man who had failed to do that at every single dinner, and who was now standing in front of her, finally paying attention, finally asking the right questions, at exactly the moment when the truthful answer would end everything. Look at me, Emily said quietly, and Daniel did, his eyes red-rimmed, searching her face for something he desperately needed to find. I married you because I loved you, not your family's money, not your family's name. You. That's not an answer, Daniel said. That's a deflection. I asked you a direct question. Emily felt something inside her chest split open, 2 years of swallowed anger and buried grief and quiet, patient calculation, all rising at once, fighting against the discipline she had spent months building. She thought about her father, about the office in Ohio, about the lessons he had given her that had led directly to this moment. She thought about lying to Daniel's face one more time, the way she had lied to him for months already. And she found standing there that she couldn't do it. Not fully, not anymore. What if I told you, Emily said slowly, that I know things about your family's finances that would explain how easy it was for someone to find that pressure point? What if I told you I've spent months watching your mother, listening at dinners, noticing things nobody else in this family was paying attention to? Daniel went very still. That's not an answer either. It's the closest thing to an answer I can give you right now, Emily said, her voice shaking now despite every effort to control it. Because the truth is complicated, Daniel. The truth isn't a simple yes or no. Emily. Her name came out of him like something breaking. Please, just tell me. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The kitchen felt enormous and suffocating at once. The space between them stretched thin as glass, and Emily understood that whatever she said next would determine everything that followed. Not just for her marriage, but for the entire architecture of leverage and consequence she had spent the better part of a year constructing. I think, Emily said carefully, that this conversation needs to happen with more than just the two of us in the room. I think there are things your family needs to hear, and I think they deserve to hear them properly, not in pieces, not through forensic accountants chasing shadows for weeks. Daniel's face went pale. You're not denying it. I'm telling you, Emily said, that when the truth comes out, and it will come out, I want it to come out on my terms. Not because Richard's team got lucky with a billing record, because I chose to say it. So it is you. The words came out of Daniel almost as a whisper, disbelief and horror, and something that might have been grudging awe, all tangled together in his voice. Emily didn't answer directly. She simply held his gaze steady, unflinching, the same stillness she had shown at that first dinner when she signed the prenup without a single tear. And in that silence, Daniel understood the answer more completely than any words could have provided. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, his hands pressed flat against the surface, as though he needed something solid to anchor himself. How? He said. How is any of this even possible? You're not a billionaire, Emily. You worked as an analyst. Where did the money even come from? My father, Emily said quietly. Everything he left me. every dollar I'd saved on my own. I put all of it into this. Into destroying my family. Into protecting myself, Emily said, and now her own voice hardened, 2 years of restrained fury finally finding an outlet. Your mother sat across that table and handed me a document that said I was entitled to nothing regardless of how long I stayed, regardless of what I gave up to be here. She didn't ask if I loved you. She didn't ask if I'd earned a place in this family through 2 years of showing up to every dinner, every gala, every moment where I was quietly humiliated and expected to smile through it. She decided unilaterally that I was disposable. And you sat there, Daniel. You sat right there and said nothing. Be so kasamaki. I know, Daniel said, his voice breaking. I know I failed you that night. I've thought about it every day since. But this Emily, this isn't a response to a bad night. This is systematic. This took months. This is calculated in a way that terrifies me. Everything your family does is calculated, Emily shot back. The dinners, the galas, the careful positioning of every guest at every table to maximize social advantage. You think I learned to be calculated from a stranger? I learned it from watching your mother operate for 2 years. Daniel put his head in his hands, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his shoulders shaking slightly, and Emily realized with a lurch of something that might have been guilt or might have been grief that he was crying. They're going to lose everything, he said, finally, his voice muffled. My father's health is already failing under this stress. My mother hasn't slept properly in weeks, and you're telling me you did this. You, my wife. I didn't force your family to build an empire on hidden debt, Emily said, though her own voice had softened now watching him break apart in front of her. I didn't force your father to gamble on a hospitality venture that failed. I didn't force your mother to maintain an illusion of untouchable wealth while the foundation underneath it all quietly rotted. I found a door that was already there, Daniel. I didn't build it, but you walked through it, Daniel said, lifting his head, his eyes red and raw. You walked through it knowing exactly what it would do to us. Yes, Emily said simply. There was no point denying it now. I did. The silence that followed felt like the end of something, though Emily couldn't yet tell what exactly had ended her marriage, her carefully guarded secret, or perhaps some final lingering piece of the woman she had been before that first cold dinner 2 years ago. What happens now? Daniel asked quietly. What do you want, Emily? If this is really about being seen, about being valued, then tell me, what is it you actually want to happen? Emily sat down across from him at the table, the same table where they had shared hundreds of ordinary meals over 2 years of marriage, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider that question honestly, without the armor of strategy or the cold clarity of leverage. I want your family to understand, she said slowly, that I was never nothing. That the woman they dismissed at that table, the one they assumed was lucky to marry in, had more power sitting quietly in that chair than any of them realized. I want Victoria to feel even once what it's like to have the ground disappear beneath her feet, the way she made me feel it disappear beneath mine. And after that, Daniel pressed, once she feels it, once my father's health collapses completely under the strain, once the estate that's been in my family for 4 generations is gone. What then? Do you feel better? Does that fix what happened at that dinner? Emily didn't have an immediate answer, and the absence of one frightened her more than anything Daniel had said all evening. I don't know, she admitted finally. I thought I did. I thought once I had the leverage, once I held the door, I'd know exactly what to do with it. But watching your father's hands shake at dinner last week, watching your mother cry in the garden, actually cry, Daniel, for the first time since I've known her, it didn't feel like the victory I imagined. Then stop, Daniel said, leaning forward, something desperate and pleading entering his voice. If it doesn't feel right, stop now before it goes further. Sell the debt back, walk away. I'll help you however I can, I swear it. But please, Emily, stop this before it destroys everyone, including you. Emily looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had married for love who had failed her at that dinner table, and 100 smaller moments since, but who was sitting in front of her now, finally achingly present, finally choosing her over the comfortable silence he'd maintained for 2 years. It's not that simple anymore, Emily said quietly. Your family already knows something is coming. Richard's team is days away from finding my name attached to all of it. If I disappear now quietly, without ever explaining why they'll spend the rest of their lives wondering, suspecting, tearing this family apart, looking for an enemy who already vanished. I think at this point the only way through this is straight through it. Meaning what? Meaning, Emily said, steadying herself, feeling the old familiar clarity returning sharper now for having been tested and nearly broken. I need to tell them myself, all of them, together. Not through a forensic accountant's lucky discovery, not through a leaked document. I need to sit at that table, the same table where Victoria handed me that prenup, and I need to show them exactly what they built when they decided I was worth nothing. Daniel stared at her, and something in his expression shifted the horror still present, but joined now by something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, almost like the beginning of understanding. "When?" he said finally. "Soon," Emily said. "Before Richard finds it on his own. Before your family learns the truth from a stranger's report instead of from me." Daniel nodded slowly, though his hands were still trembling on the table. "And what happens to us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "After tonight, after whatever happens at that table, what happens to you and me?" Emily reached across the table, and this time when she took his hand, there was no performance left in the gesture, only the raw, uncertain truth of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them could fully see the other side of. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I genuinely don't know, Daniel, but I know I can't keep living inside a lie that's been building for a year. Whatever happens next, it starts with the truth, all of it, at that table." Outside, the evening had fully given way to night, and somewhere across the county, at the Harrington estate, Victoria Harrington sat alone in her study, staring at a stack of unresolved legal documents, unaware that within days, the daughter-in-law she had finally grudgingly begun to respect would be the one to bring her entire world down around her, not out of cruelty, but out of a debt far older and far deeper than any figure written on a balance sheet. Emily called Patricia the next morning before Daniel had even finished his coffee, her voice low, deliberate, stripped of any hesitation that had lingered the night before. "I need everything organized," Emily said. "Every document, every transfer record, the full ownership chain laid out clearly enough that a room full of frightened people can understand it in under 10 minutes. "You're doing it," Patricia said. It wasn't a question. "I'm doing it," Emily confirmed. "This week. Emily, I want to remind you, once this becomes public knowledge inside that family, you lose all control over the narrative. Right now, you decide when, how, and to whom. The moment you sit down at that table, that control is gone. They'll react however they react." "I know," Emily said. "I've thought about nothing else since last night." There was a pause on the line, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, some of the professional distance falling away. "For what it's worth, I've represented a lot of people building leverage like this. Most of them wanted revenge, plain and simple, and they never hesitated the way you have. That hesitation isn't weakness. It might be the only thing keeping this from becoming something you regret." "Thank you," Emily said quietly, and meant it. She hung up the phone and sat alone in her kitchen for a long time, the morning light stretching slowly across the counter where only hours earlier Daniel had asked her the question that ended 2 years of careful silence between them. Daniel had left early for work, though calling it work felt generous given the hollow, shattered way he'd moved through the house before leaving, barely meeting her eyes, barely speaking beyond a murmured goodbye that carried none of its usual warmth. Emily didn't blame him. She had spent a year building toward a single moment of reckoning, and he had spent one sleepless night absorbing the full weight of what that reckoning would cost him personally. His family, his sense of who his wife actually was. She wondered, staring at her cooling coffee, whether he would tell Victoria before Emily got the chance to speak for herself. The question answered itself 2 days later. Emily's phone rang mid-afternoon, Victoria's name lighting up the screen, and something in the timing made Emily's stomach drop before she even answered. "Emily," Victoria said, and her voice carried a strange, brittle calm that Emily had never heard from her before, not even during the darkest of the recent family meetings. "I need you to come to the estate, now if you can." "Is everything all right?" "I'd rather discuss it in person," Victoria said, and the careful control in her voice told Emily everything she needed to know. Daniel had told her. or Richard's team had finally found the name. Either way, the 30 days Emily had asked Patricia to buy her had collapsed into hours. "I'll be there within the hour," Emily said. She drove to the estate with her hands steady on the wheel, though her heart hammered against her ribs the entire way past the same iron gates that had closed behind her and Daniel's car so many times before, up the long gravel drive lined with the same century-old oaks that had stood witness to 4 generations of Harrington triumphs, and now they're unraveling. Victoria was waiting for her in the study, not the dining room, and Emily understood immediately that this would not be a full family confrontation. Not yet. Victoria wanted her alone first. "Sit down," Victoria said, gesturing to the chair across from Thomas's desk, though Thomas himself was nowhere in sight. Emily sat. Victoria remained standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her usual composure fractured at the edges in a way that made her look, for the first time since Emily had known her, genuinely her age. "Daniel came to me last night," Victoria said without preamble. "He told me things I find very difficult to believe even now, even sitting here looking at you." "What did he tell you?" Emily asked, though she already knew. "That my daughter-in-law, the woman I welcomed eventually into this family, spent the better part of a year secretly acquiring the debt that is currently threatening to destroy everything my husband's family has built over 4 generations. Victoria's voice cracked slightly on the word destroy, and she paused, visibly gathering herself before continuing. "Tell me he's wrong." Emily held her gaze steadily. "He's not wrong." Something in Victoria's face collapsed just slightly, a crack spreading through composure that had been carefully maintained for 6 decades. She sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk, no longer able to remain standing under the weight of confirmation. "Why?" Victoria said, and the single word carried more genuine anguish than Emily had ever heard from her. "You know why," Emily said quietly. "The prenup," Victoria said. "This is about the prenup. It's about 2 years of being told in 100 different ways that I would never truly belong in this family. It's about the prenup, yes, but it's about everything the prenup represented. That I was disposable, replaceable, that whatever I gave up to be part of this family meant nothing because in the end you never intended for me to keep anything. That's not—" Victoria started, then stopped herself, pressing her lips together, and Emily watched her mother-in-law wrestle visibly with the instinct to defend herself against an accusation she could no longer credibly deny. "It's exactly what it was, Victoria," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "I sat at that table and read 40 pages of legal language designed to ensure that no matter how long I stayed, no matter what I sacrificed, I would leave with nothing if this family ever decided I was no longer useful. You called it standard protection. I called it a warning. I was right." Victoria's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect this family's legacy. I've watched money-hungry women marry into families like ours before, Emily. I've seen what happens when the wrong person gains access to generational wealth." "I never wanted your money," Emily said. "I wanted to be seen as a person instead of a threat to be managed. And instead of ever considering that possibility, you treated me exactly the way you're describing right now, as a calculated risk instead of your son's wife." The room fell silent, heavy, with 2 years of accumulated grievance finally spilling into open air, and Victoria, for the first time in Emily's memory, seemed to have no immediate response prepared. "What do you want?" Victoria said finally, her voice smaller than Emily had ever heard it. "If this was never about the money, if this was about being seen as you say, what is it you actually want from us now?" Emily thought about that question, the same one Daniel had asked her days earlier, and found that her answer had sharpened since then, clarified by the intervening days of preparation and reflection. "I want the full family together," Emily said. "Not you and me alone in this study. All of you. Thomas, Richard, Daniel. Everyone who sat at that table the night you slid that prenup across to me. I want to show you exactly what you built when you decided I was worth nothing." "And then what?" Victoria asked. "You humiliate us. You take the estate. Is that the plan, revenge dressed up as some kind of justice?" "I haven't decided what happens after," Emily said honestly. "But I know it starts with truth. All of it. Out in the open where nobody can pretend it isn't real." Victoria studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Calculation returning even through the visible devastation, the same instinct for strategy that had built and protected this family for generations, reasserting itself even in the depths of crisis. "When?" Victoria said finally. "This weekend," Emily said. "Saturday. All of you together at the estate." Victoria nodded slowly, and then, unexpectedly, she reached across the space between them and took Emily's hand, the same gesture she had offered in the garden days earlier, though this time it carried a different weight entirely, less comfort and more something closer to negotiation. "Whatever you're planning to say Saturday," Victoria said quietly, "I need you to understand something first. My husband's health has deteriorated badly over the past month. The stress of this uncertainty, not knowing who was coming for us or why, has taken a physical toll I don't think you fully appreciate. If you walk into that room and simply destroy him without any consideration for what that might cost, I don't know if he survives it." Emily felt something twist painfully in her chest. She had heard through Daniel about Thomas's trembling hands, his weight loss, his hollow, sleepless appearance at recent dinners, but hearing it stated directly by Victoria, framed as a genuine warning about her husband's survival, landed with a different, heavier gravity. "I'm not trying to hurt him specifically," Emily said. "I never wanted anyone's health to suffer over this." "And yet it has," Victoria said. "That's the trouble with leverage like this, Emily. You can aim it precisely, but the damage rarely stays contained to where you intended it." The words lingered in the room long after Victoria finished speaking, and Emily drove home that evening, turning them over in her mind, wondering not for the first time whether the reckoning she had built so carefully had already grown beyond anything she could still fully control. The days leading up to Saturday passed in a strange, suspended tension the household caught between two people who had once shared easy affection and now moved around each other with careful, deliberate distance. Daniel slept in the guest room without either of them discussing it explicitly, an unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted between them, and neither was ready to pretend otherwise. On Thursday evening, he finally broke the silence, finding Emily in her home office, surrounded by the folder Patricia had couriered over that afternoon, thick with documentation timelines, ownership records, everything laid out in careful, methodical order. "Can I see it?" Daniel asked, gesturing to the folder. "Before Saturday, I think I need to understand exactly what you're going to show them so I'm not blindsided in front of my entire family." Emily hesitated, then nodded, sliding the folder across her desk toward him. Daniel sat down slowly and began reading, his face growing paler with each page, each carefully documented transfer, each layer of the acquisition Emily had built over the better part of a year. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, though his voice when he spoke was steadier than Emily expected. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "Not just what you did, how you did it. This is—" He shook his head, searching for the word. "This is exactly the kind of thing my father spent his entire career trying to do and never quite managed. Careful, untraceable, patient beyond anything I've ever seen." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Emily asked. "I don't know what it's supposed to be," Daniel admitted. "I think I'm still trying to reconcile the woman who did this with the woman I've been married to for 2 years. And the strange thing is, the more I read, the less I recognize a stranger, and the more I recognize you. Every instinct in here, the patience, the precision, the refusal to move until you were certain that's exactly who you've always been. I think I just never understood what you were capable of building with it." Emily felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks, the accumulated exhaustion of months of secrecy finally cracking through her composure. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. "I need you to know that whatever happened Saturday, this was never about you." "I know," Daniel said. "I think I've known that since the kitchen, honestly. Even in the middle of my own shock and fear, some part of me understood exactly why you did this. That doesn't make it easy to accept, but I understand it." He reached across the desk and took her hand the first time he had initiated contact since the night everything came apart between them, and Emily held on tightly, grateful for even this small, fragile reconnection. "What happens to us?" Daniel asked quietly, "after Saturday?" "I don't know," Emily said honestly, for the second time in as many conversations. "I think that depends on what happens in that room, on whether your family can survive hearing the truth without breaking entirely, on whether you can forgive me for the year I spent building toward this without telling you. And can you forgive them? Daniel asked. For the prenup, for everything before it. Because I think that question matters just as much as whether they can forgive you. Emily didn't have an answer ready, and the silence stretched between them heavy with everything still unresolved. Friday brought an unexpected complication. Richard called Daniel directly, his voice tight with urgency, informing him that the forensic accounting team had finally definitively confirmed the connection between the Delaware holding company and Emily's name, tracing it through a banking transfer that Patricia's careful structuring hadn't fully anticipated. Richard wanted to bring the information immediately to Thomas and Victoria before Emily's planned Saturday meeting could unfold on her own terms. Daniel, for the first time in the entire ordeal, made a decision entirely on his own without consulting Emily first. "Don't," he told Richard over the phone, Emily standing beside him, listening with held breath. "I already know. Emily's coming to the estate tomorrow to explain everything herself to the whole family together. Let her do that, please, Richard. She deserves the chance to say this on her own terms, not have it dragged out of her by a forensic report." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Richard finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. "You're defending her, after everything she's done to this family." "I'm not defending what she did," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to let her explain why. There's a difference, Richard, even if it's hard to see right now." Richard agreed reluctantly to hold the information until Saturday. And when Daniel hung up the phone, Emily looked at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Because whatever happens tomorrow," Daniel said, "I think you deserve to be the one who tells them. Not some report Richard's team assembled without any understanding of why any of this happened. You built something extraordinary, Emily, even if I'm still working through how I feel about it. The least this family can do is hear it from you directly." Saturday arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire county gray clouds, gathering low over the Westchester Hills as Emily dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple, dark blue dress, understated deliberate nothing that could be read as celebration or triumph. This was not a day for victory. She understood that now, more clearly than she had at any point during the long months of planning. Daniel drove them to the estate in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, and when they passed through the iron gates for what felt like the 1,000th time in 2 years of marriage, Emily felt the full weight of everything converging toward a single point, a single room, a single folder that would change the trajectory of every life connected to this family. The dining room when they arrived was already filling with relatives Emily recognized from countless previous dinners, faces that had once looked at her with polite, dismissive tolerance, now creased with confusion and barely restrained anxiety. Richard stood near the window, his own folder tucked under his arm, glancing at Emily with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, suspicion mixed with something that might have been reluctant curiosity. Thomas sat at the head of the table, and the sight of him struck Emily harder than she expected. He looked frail in a way that had nothing to do with age. His once commanding presence diminished to something smaller, more fragile, a man visibly worn down by weeks of uncertainty he had never fully understood. Victoria sat beside him, upright, composed on the surface. Though Emily noticed the careful stillness of her hands folded in her lap, the same discipline Emily herself had learned to project even while feeling entirely unmoored underneath. Whitney and the extended cousins filled the remaining seats, whispering among themselves, clearly aware that something significant was about to unfold without knowing precisely what. Emily took a seat near the far end of the table, the same general position she had occupied the night of the prenup, and the symmetry was not lost on her. "Thank you all for coming," Victoria said, standing to address the room, her voice carrying its usual authority, despite the visible strain beneath it. "Emily has asked to speak with the family today regarding the situation with our finances. I think given everything we've all endured over the past several weeks, we owe her the courtesy of listening." Every eye in the room turned toward Emily, and she felt the full weight of 11 people's attention settling over her, the same paralyzing scrutiny she had felt the night she signed the prenup. Though now the power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that the sensation felt almost unrecognizable. She reached into her bag and withdrew the folder Patricia had prepared, the same one Daniel had reviewed 2 nights earlier, and placed it on the table in front of her without yet opening it. 2 years ago, Emily began, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt in her chest. I sat in this exact room and signed a prenuptial agreement that told me in no uncertain terms that I would leave this family with nothing, regardless of how long I stayed or what I sacrificed to be here. Victoria called it standard protection. I understood it as something else entirely. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, and Emily continued. I want to be honest with all of you today because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. For the past year, I have been quietly acquiring the debt currently threatening this family's financial stability. The room erupted immediately, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. Whitney's hand flying to her mouth, one of the older cousins half rising from his chair before sitting back down heavily. Richard's expression shifting from suspicion to something like vindicated fury. I knew it, Richard said. I told you, Thomas. I told you this had to be someone close to the family. Let her finish, Daniel said sharply, and the room quieted, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Thomas, who had said nothing since Emily began speaking, finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers across the length of the table, and the expression on his face was not quite what Emily expected. Not fury. Something closer to exhausted, weary recognition. Why? He said, simply echoing the same question Victoria had asked her days earlier in the study. Because you built an empire on the assumption that appearance was the same thing as strength, Emily said. Because for 2 years this family treated me as an afterthought, someone tolerated rather than valued, someone whose contributions, whose intelligence, whose entire personhood meant nothing beyond whatever convenience I provided. I read the prenup that night, and I understood exactly what you all believed about me. And I decided quietly that I would show you what you'd overlooked. You've destroyed us, Victoria said, her composure finally cracking fully, her voice rising with a raw, unguarded fury Emily had never witnessed from her before. Do you understand what you've done? This estate has been in this family for 4 generations. Thomas's health has deteriorated to the point where his doctor has warned us about his heart. And you did all of this quietly, patiently, while sitting at our table pretending to be part of this family. I never had to pretend, Emily said, her own voice hardening now. I loved your son. I showed up to every dinner, every gala, every moment where this family made clear I would always be an outsider, and I stayed anyway. That wasn't pretending, Victoria. That was 2 years of genuine effort that this family never once acknowledged. So this is punishment, Thomas said quietly, for not acknowledging you properly. This is consequence, Emily said. There's a difference. The room fell into a heavy, uncertain silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present, and Emily looked around the table at the faces that had once dismissed her so easily, now staring back at her with something between fear and reluctant dawning respect. What do you want? Richard asked, finally echoing the question that had been asked of Emily twice already in the preceding days. You have the leverage now. You've proven your point. What is it you actually want to happen from here? Emily looked down at the folder still resting unopened on the table in front of her, containing within it the full documented truth of everything she had built. And she felt the entire trajectory of the past year converging toward this single unresolved question. The same one she had been unable to fully answer for Daniel, for Victoria, for Patricia, and now finally for herself. She opened the folder. I think, Emily said slowly, it's time you all saw exactly what I own. Emily opened the folder and turned it so the entire table could see the first document inside, a summary page Patricia had prepared specifically for moments like this one, stripped of legal jargon, written in plain, unmistakable language that even the most panicked reader could understand in seconds. This is Ashford Capital Partners' original position, Emily said, sliding the page toward the center of the table. The distressed debt tied to the hospitality venture your family gambled on in the early 2000s. I acquired the full position through a holding company registered in Delaware, structured across 3 separate tranches over the course of 11 months. Richard leaned forward, scanning the numbers with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years reading exactly this kind of document, and Emily watched his expression shift from disbelief to something closer to professional astonishment. This is airtight, he said quietly, almost to himself. There's no gap here. no exposure. Whoever structured this knew precisely what they were doing. I had excellent counsel, Emily said. Counsel doesn't build patience like this, Richard said, looking up at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, something like reluctant professional respect cutting through his fury. This took discipline most institutional investors don't have. You waited months between moves. You never rushed a single transfer, even when it would have been faster to consolidate. I had a good teacher, Emily said. My father spent his career walking into companies that looked strong on paper and finding exactly where they were rotting underneath. He taught me patience mattered more than speed. Thomas, still seated at the head of the table, reached slowly for the summary page, his trembling hands betraying the effort it took him to hold it steady enough to read. Victoria watched him with visible fear, one hand hovering near his shoulder, as though she might need to catch him. You own all of it, Thomas said, not a question this time, simply a statement of fact, settling into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every dollar of debt secured against this estate belongs to you. Yes, Emily said. Then you could call it in. Thomas continued, his voice hollow. Right now, force immediate repayment. Take the east wing, the grounds, whatever assets are secured against this position. You could take it all, and there would be nothing any of us could do to stop you. I could, Emily agreed. Then why haven't you? Victoria demanded. Her composure fractured now beyond any repair tears standing in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Why sit here explaining yourself instead of simply taking what you've maneuvered so carefully to acquire? Emily looked around the table slowly at Whitney's stricken face, at the cousins she barely knew, who had nonetheless whispered about her for 2 years, at Richard's grudging respect, at Thomas's frail exhaustion, at Victoria's cracked, desperate fury, and finally at Daniel sitting beside her, watching her with an expression that held more love and more fear than she had ever seen on his face at once, because taking it was never actually the point, Emily said quietly. I built this because I needed you to understand something you refused to see for 2 years, that I was never nothing, that the woman you all dismissed as lucky to marry in had more capability sitting quietly in that chair than this entire family combined. I needed you to feel even once what it's like to have the ground disappear beneath you without warning, the same way I felt it disappear the night Victoria slid that prenup across this table and called it nothing personal. And now that we've felt it, Thomas said slowly, what happens next? Emily took a breath, steadying herself for the sentence she had rehearsed 100 times in the days leading up to this moment, though saying it out loud in this room in front of everyone felt entirely different from rehearsing it alone. I'm not going to force repayment, she said. I'm not going to seize the estate. That was never actually what I wanted, even in the months when I told myself it might be. But I am not simply walking away and pretending the last year didn't happen either. Then what? Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want the prenup renegotiated, Emily said. Not because I want your money, Victoria. I want it removed, entirely replaced with a standard agreement that treats me as an equal partner in this marriage, the way I should have been treated from the very beginning. I want a public acknowledgement within this family that the assumptions you made about me were wrong. And I want Thomas's health prioritized over any further attempt to trace or punish what I've done, because whatever anger exists in this room, it doesn't justify anyone's life being put at further risk. The room absorbed this in stunned silence, the demand so much smaller than anyone had expected, given the scale of what Emily had proven she was capable of. That's it, Richard said, disbelief coloring his voice. You held the power to destroy this entire family financially, and all you want is a renegotiated prenup and an apology. It was never about the money, Emily said again, and this time the words carried a weight that seemed to finally land settling over the table with undeniable sincerity. It was about being seen, about being valued. Everything else was simply the only language this family seemed capable of understanding. Victoria sat very still for a long moment, staring at Emily across the length of the table. Something shifting slowly behind her eyes, the last remnants of her composure giving way to something rawer and more honest than Emily had ever witnessed from her. I misjudged you, Victoria said finally, her voice cracking on every word. From the very first dinner, I looked at you and I saw someone who didn't belong, someone who would eventually leave the way the others did, and I built every interaction around protecting this family from a threat that never actually existed the way I imagined it. The real threat was never your background, Emily. It was my own blindness. Thomas reached over and took Victoria's hand, and for the first time since Emily had known them, she watched something genuinely vulnerable pass between the two of them, stripped of performance, stripped of legacy, simply two frightened people confronting the consequences of choices made long before Emily ever entered their lives. "I'll have the legal team draft a new agreement Monday morning," Thomas said quietly. "Whatever terms you consider fair, Emily. You've more than earned the right to set them." Emily felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what its absence might feel like. She looked at Daniel, who reached for her hand under the table, his fingers lacing through hers, with a firmness that told her more clearly than any words could that whatever came next, they would face it together. The room remained heavy with the aftermath of everything that had been said, but underneath the exhaustion, something had shifted permanently, a reckoning that had finally run its course, leaving behind not the destruction Emily had once imagined, but the fragile, uncertain beginning of something the Harrington family had never once considered giving her. Respect freely offered instead of grudgingly extended. Monday morning arrived with a strange, fragile quiet settling over the Harrington estate, the kind of quiet that follows an earthquake when the ground has stopped shaking, but everyone is still too afraid to trust that stillness. Emily sat in the same kitchen where Daniel had once asked her, "Is it you?" and watched him move through the house with the careful, deliberate steps of a man still recalibrating everything he thought he understood about his own life. "The lawyers are coming at 11, Daniel said, setting his coffee down without drinking it. "My father's team. Patricia's coming too, right?" "She'll be there," Emily said. She insisted on it, actually, said she wasn't about to let a year of careful work get undone by a rushed negotiation. Daniel nodded, then paused at the doorway, looking back at her with an expression that had grown more familiar over the past 2 days, something raw and unresolved that neither of them had found the words to fully address yet. "Are we going to talk about us at some point? Not the estate, not the debt, just us." "After today," Emily said. "I promise, I just need to get through this first." He accepted that though the tightness in his shoulders as he left suggested the promise weighed on him more than he let on. The estate study, when Emily arrived that morning, had been transformed from the tense battleground of Saturday's confrontation into something that resembled an actual negotiation. Long legal pads and printed documents spread across Thomas's mahogany desk. Patricia seated to Emily's left, the Harrington family's longtime attorney, a stern woman named Deborah Ashcroft, seated across from them beside Thomas and Victoria. "Let's begin with the prenuptial agreement," Deborah said, adjusting her glasses. "Mrs. Harrington has requested it be voided entirely and replaced with a standard marital agreement reflecting equal partnership. Is that still the position?" "It is," Emily said. Victoria, seated beside Thomas, said nothing, though Emily noticed the way her hands remained folded tightly in her lap, the posture of a woman still working to accept a version of events she had never imagined possible 3 weeks earlier. "And the debt position," Deborah continued. "Mrs. Harrington's holding company currently controls the entirety of the obligation secured against portions of the estate. What are your intentions regarding that position going forward?" Emily glanced at Patricia, who gave a small encouraging nod and then looked directly at Thomas. "I'm not calling in the debt," she said. "I never intended to seize this family's property, but I also don't think it's healthy for either of us for me to continue holding leverage over this family indefinitely. I want to restructure the debt at fair market terms your finance team would recognize as legitimate and transfer servicing back to a conventional lender within the next 6 months." Richard, who had been invited to sit in on the negotiation, despite his continued discomfort with the entire situation, looked up sharply. "You're giving up the leverage entirely." "I never wanted permanent control," Emily said. I wanted acknowledgement. Those aren't the same thing, and I think continuing to hold this over your family indefinitely would only poison whatever chance we have of actually rebuilding trust. Thomas exhaled slowly, some of the tension visibly leaving his shoulders for the first time in weeks. That's more generosity than I expected given everything. I'm not being generous, Emily said. I'm being honest about what I actually wanted. The rest was leverage I needed to make sure I'd finally be heard. The negotiations continued for the better part of 3 hours, each provision debated, refined, and ultimately agreed upon with a level of mutual respect that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. By early afternoon, the outline of a new agreement had taken shape, one that recognized Emily as an equal partner in the marriage, dissolved the punitive terms of the original prenup, and established a clear, fair timeline for the debt restructuring that would return the Harrington family's finances to stable, conventional footing without leaving Emily's year of careful work meaningless. When the meeting finally concluded, Victoria lingered behind as the others filed out, catching Emily's arm gently before she could leave the room. "I want you to know," Victoria said quietly, "that what you did today, giving up the leverage instead of using it to extract everything you could, that told me more about your character than anything else could have. I spent 2 years believing you were exactly the kind of woman I feared. I was wrong, and I don't say that lightly." "Thank you," Emily said, and this time the words between them carried none of the guarded tension that had colored every previous exchange. "There's something else," Victoria said, hesitating in a way that seemed foreign to her usual commanding certainty. "Thomas's doctor called this morning. His blood pressure has stabilized significantly since Saturday. The cardiologist thinks the stress of the uncertainty was doing far more damage than we realized. Now that there's resolution, even difficult resolution, his body seems to be responding." Emily felt something warm and unexpected rise in her chest. Relief mixed with the lingering guilt she suspected would take considerably longer to fully resolve. "I'm glad," she said simply. "I never wanted anyone's health to suffer for this." "I know that now," Victoria said, "though I confess it took me longer to believe than it should have." Over the following weeks, life at the Harrington estate settled into an unfamiliar rhythm, one neither entirely healed nor entirely broken, but moving slowly towards something that resembled genuine repair. Family dinners resumed, though they carried a different texture, now less performance, more honest conversation. Victoria occasionally catching herself mid-sentence and softening a comment she might once have delivered with cutting precision. Daniel and Emily's own reconciliation moved more slowly. He returned to their bedroom 2 weeks after the confrontation, the distance between them narrowing gradually. Rather than all at once, both of them navigating the strange territory of a marriage that had survived something neither of them fully understood how to categorize. "I keep thinking about what you said," Daniel told her one evening sitting across from her at their own kitchen table, the modest one in their own home rather than the grand mahogany table at the estate. "About being seen, about 2 years of feeling like an afterthought." "I didn't say it to hurt you," Emily said. "I know," Daniel said, "but it made me realize how much I let happen at that table night after night because standing up to my mother felt harder than staying quiet and hoping things would eventually get better on their own. I failed you long before you ever touched that debt. I think I need you to know I understand that now." "You're here," Emily said. "You chose to hear the truth instead of running from it. That matters more than you probably realize." "Does it?" Daniel asked, uncertain in a way that revealed how deeply the past weeks had shaken his confidence. "Does it matter enough?" Emily reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture that had carried them through so many uncertain moments over the preceding weeks. "We're still here," she said. "Both of us. That has to count for something." It wasn't a complete answer, and both of them understood that healing a marriage built on 2 years of unspoken resentment and 1 year of hidden financial warfare would take considerably longer than a single conversation could resolve. But it was, Emily thought, an honest beginning, which was more than either of them had allowed themselves in a very long time. 6 weeks after the confrontation at the estate, the Harrington Foundation's gala finally proceeded. Delayed but not canceled a decision Victoria made deliberately, telling Emily privately that she wanted the family's first public appearance since the crisis to demonstrate resilience rather than retreat. Emily attended at Daniel's side, and for the first time in 2 years, she noticed something different in the way the extended family and social circle regarded her. Whitney approached her early in the evening, her earlier lightness returning, though tempered now with something more sincere. "I owe you an apology," Whitney said. "For all the comments over the years. I always thought you were just quiet because you didn't have much to say. Turns out you were just smarter than the rest of us combined." "You don't owe me an apology," Emily said, though she appreciated the gesture more than she let on. "I do," Whitney insisted. "This family spent 2 years underestimating you and honestly watching you handle everything the way you did. Protecting my grandmother's health, giving up leverage you could have used to destroy us. I think you showed more class than any of us have managed in generations." Richard found her later in the evening standing near the terrace where the gala's string quartet played softly against the backdrop of the estate's illuminated gardens. "I want to say something," Richard said professionally, not personally. "What you built, the structure, the patience, the discipline of waiting months between moves when a lesser strategist would have rushed, that was genuinely exceptional work. If you're ever interested in consulting formally, I'd welcome the opportunity to work alongside someone with that level of skill." Emily smiled, genuinely surprised by the offer. "I appreciate that, Richard, though I think I've had enough of secret financial maneuvering to last me quite a while." "Fair enough," Richard said, chuckling despite himself. "Though for what it's worth, this family is lucky the person who found our vulnerability decided mercy mattered more than victory." The evening continued, and at one point Thomas found Emily alone near the edge of the terrace, his color noticeably improved from the frail, trembling man he had been weeks earlier. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing restraint. I've spent my career surrounded by people who would have used exactly the leverage you built to take everything, and instead, you gave us a path back to stability. I don't think I would have extended you that same mercy if our positions had been reversed." "Maybe that's part of why this happened at all," Emily said, "because this family built its entire identity around never having to extend anyone mercy. I wanted you to understand what it felt like to need it." Thomas absorbed that for a long moment, nodding slowly. A hard lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. As the evening wound toward its close, Victoria approached the small gathering, raising a glass toward Emily in a gesture that carried none of the performative warmth Emily had grown accustomed to over 2 years, but something that felt for the first time entirely genuine. "To family," Victoria said, "built on honesty instead of assumption. Something this family should have learned considerably sooner." The following months brought their own quiet chapter of transformation. The new prenuptial agreement was finalized, formalizing Emily's status as an equal partner rather than a tolerated addition. And though the document itself carried little practical weight, given Emily's own independent means, its symbolic importance rippled through every subsequent interaction with the family. The debt restructuring proceeded exactly as Emily had promised, transferred over 6 months to a conventional lending institution at fair market terms. The pressure gradually lifted from the Harrington family's finances without the punitive edge that had characterized the crisis at its peak. Thomas's health continued improving. His cardiologist eventually clearing him for the modest travel and activity level he had enjoyed before the stress of the unresolved threat had taken its toll. Emily and Daniel's marriage healed more slowly through months of difficult, necessary conversations neither of them had allowed themselves before the crisis forced everything into the open. They attended counseling together, something Emily suspected the old version of Daniel, the one who avoided conflict at every family dinner, would never have agreed to. But the man who emerged from the wreckage of that confrontation proved willing to do the harder work their marriage had always needed. "I used to think loyalty meant staying quiet," Daniel told her during one particularly raw session, "protecting the peace, even when the peace wasn't fair to you. I understand now that real loyalty means standing beside you, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means disagreeing with my own mother." It was, Emily thought, exactly the acknowledgement she had spent 2 years silently hoping for, arriving finally not through confrontation over the debt, but through the slower, harder work of 2 people choosing deliberately to rebuild something worth keeping. A year after the confrontation at the estate, Emily stood once again in the Harrington dining room, though the occasion this time carried none of the tension that had once defined every gathering at that table. Victoria had organized a smaller dinner, just the immediate family, to celebrate Thomas's full recovery and the successful completion of the debt restructuring that had finally officially released the family from the shadow that had hung over them for the better part of a year. "I want to say something," Victoria announced, rising from her seat with a glass in hand, and the room quieted, familiar with the ritual, though the sentiment behind it had changed entirely from the cold, calculated toasts of years past. "A year ago at this very table, I made a decision I believed was protecting this family. I was wrong about what protection actually meant. I thought strength was walls, boundaries, keeping the wrong people at a careful, controlled distance. Emily taught me something different. That real strength is the willingness to be honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable, even when it means admitting you were wrong about someone for 2 entire years." Emily felt Daniel's hand find hers under the table, warm and steady, and she looked around the room at faces that had once regarded her with careful suspicion, now watching her with something closer to genuine warmth. "To Emily," Victoria continued, raising her glass higher, "who showed this family that the quietest person at the table often holds more strength than anyone realizes, and who chose mercy when she could easily have chosen destruction. This family is better, stronger, and considerably more honest because of you." The table raised their glasses in unison, and this time the gesture carried none of the hollow performance Emily had grown accustomed to during her first 2 years of marriage. It felt for the first time since she had walked into this family, as a nervous young bride, certain she would never truly belong, like an authentic welcome. Later that evening, as the gathering wound down and guests began drifting toward their cars, Emily found herself alone in the garden, standing near the same broken fountain where she had once received the call from Patricia that set the entire acquisition into motion. Daniel found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against her shoulder. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Any of it?" Emily considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind, the way she had turned over so many decisions throughout the past year, weighing every consequence, every cost, every unexpected outcome. "I regret the fear it caused your father," she said finally. "I regret the nights I spent lying to you about where I was and what I was doing. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret refusing to accept being treated as disposable. If I'd stayed silent, if I'd simply absorbed that prenup and moved on the way your family expected me to, I think some essential part of myself would have quietly disappeared piece by piece. Over years of small humiliations I convinced myself didn't matter. And now," Daniel asked, "how do you feel now that it's over?" Emily thought about the woman she had been at that first cold dinner, silent, calm, absorbing an insult designed to remind her exactly where she stood in this family's hierarchy. She thought about the months of careful patient work that followed the late nights, studying financial records, the fear of discovery, the guilt watching Thomas's hands tremble, the terror of Daniel's question in their kitchen. "Is it you?" and the long, uncertain path back towards something resembling trust and partnership. "Like myself," Emily said simply. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel entirely like myself." Daniel turned her gently to face him, studying her expression in the soft evening light. "I love you," he said. "Not the version of you my family expected, or the version I assumed I married. This version. The one who built an empire out of patience and quiet conviction, because she refused to be treated as less than what she actually was." "I love you too," Emily said, and for the first time since the night of the prenup, the words carried no complication, no hidden calculation, simply the honest truth of two people who had survived something neither of them could have anticipated and had chosen deliberately to build something stronger from the wreckage. They stood together in the garden a while longer, the estate glowing warmly behind them, 300 acres of history and legacy that had nearly crumbled under the weight of assumptions nobody had thought to question, until Emily forced the entire family to finally see clearly. The Harrington name would continue stronger now for having been tested, its foundation rebuilt not on illusion and hidden debt, but on the harder, more durable materials of honesty and earned respect. Victoria would spend the coming years quietly changing the way she spoke about the women who married into families like theirs, no longer assuming disposability, but extending finally the benefit of genuine consideration. Thomas would live another decade in considerably better health than his doctors had predicted during the darkest weeks of the crisis, grateful in his own quiet way for the daughter-in-law who had chosen mercy over destruction when she held every advantage. And Emily, the woman who had once sat silently at that table, absorbing a warning disguised as protection, would carry forward the lesson her father had given her years earlier in a modest office in Ohio, the lesson that had guided every careful, patient step of the year that followed. Wealth was never simply appearance. It was structure. And the woman who understood the difference, who recognized that true power required neither noise nor cruelty, but only patience and clarity, would never again allow herself to be mistaken for someone with nothing to offer. She had proven in the end that the most dangerous assumption anyone could make was believing the quietest person in the room had the least power to reshape everything around her. And Emily Carter Harrington, standing in the garden of the family that had once dismissed her so easily, understood with complete and unshakable certainty that she would never again let anyone convince her otherwise.